Picture this. You're a 17-year-old servant girl from a small French village, and you wake up in complete darkness in an underground stone chamber. Your wrists burn from the rope that binds them above your head, and the walls around you are slick with moisture and something else you don't want to identify. Your body aches from the previous night's experiments, as the nobleman calls them, though you know there's something far more sinister. The iron door creaks open, and torchlight floods the room, casting dancing shadows that make the instruments hanging on the walls look like twisted sculptures designed by demons themselves. Heavy footsteps echo on the stone floor, and you know he's coming back for more. You've been missing for 3 days, and your family thinks you ran away with a lover, but the truth is far more horrifying. You're trapped in the private hell of Donatien Alphonse Francois, the Marquis de Sade, the man whose very name would become synonymous with cruelty itself, and what he's done to you represents just the beginning of a reign of terror that would consume dozens of innocent lives. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. Please comment below to let me know where you're watching from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these dark corners of history together from different parts of the world, connected by our shared need to understand how evil can wear the mask of nobility and refinement. What you're about to hear isn't just another tale of aristocratic excess. This is the story of how absolute power, infinite wealth, and complete moral abandonment can transform a human being into something that defies description. The Marquis de Sade wasn't just a writer of disturbing fiction. He was a predator whose real-life victims suffered horrors that make his novels seem tame by comparison. His name lives on in the word sadism, but the true extent of his crimes has been hidden behind centuries of academic sanitization and aristocratic cover-ups. Let's start with the man who would become the architect of systematic cruelty. Donatien wasn't born a monster, though the seeds of his future depravity were planted early in the toxic soil of 18th century French aristocracy. Born in 1740 into one of France's oldest noble families, he grew up in a world where human beings were divided into two categories: those who mattered and those who existed solely for the pleasure of their betters. His father, Jean-Baptiste de Sade, was a diplomat and libertine who viewed sexual conquest as both sport and birthright. His mother, Marie-Éléonore de Maillet, was a cold, distant woman more concerned with social status than maternal affection. The young Marquis learned his first lessons about power and pain at the prestigious Jesuit school of Louis le Grand in Paris. The priests who educated him believed that suffering purified the soul, and they applied this philosophy with enthusiastic brutality. Daily beatings were considered character-building exercises, and the boys were encouraged to report each other's minor infractions to earn favor with their tormentors. For most students, this created lasting trauma. For Donatien, it created something far more dangerous, an understanding that pain could be both weapon and pleasure. But it was during his teenage years at his uncle's abbey that the future Marquis discovered his true calling. The Abbé de Sade was a man of God in name only, using his religious position to indulge in appetites that would have scandalized even the notoriously corrupt French court. The abbey's basement contained rooms that were never mentioned in official records, chambers where the abbé conducted theological experiments on young novices and local peasant children who had been brought for spiritual guidance. Donatien watched and learned. He observed how terror could be cultivated and maintained, how hope could be offered and then systematically destroyed, how the human spirit could be broken through careful application of physical and psychological torment. Most disturbing of all, he discovered that witnessing others' suffering produced in him a physical pleasure that was more intense than anything he had previously experienced. The first recorded incident that hints at the Marquis's developing pathology occurred when he was 19. A young maid at the family estate in Provence disappeared during one of his visits home from military service. The girl, Marie-Jeanne Testard, was found 3 days later wandering naked through the countryside, her body covered in mysterious wounds and her mind apparently shattered. She spoke of being taken to underground rooms where the young lord conducted philosophical experiments on the nature of pain. The local authorities were paid to forget the incident, and Marie-Jeanne was quietly committed to a convent where she spent the rest of her short life in a state of catatonic terror. But word of the incident reached certain circles in Paris, where it was viewed not with horror, but with curiosity. The French aristocracy of the 1760s was bored with conventional pleasures and eager to explore new frontiers of experience. Donatien's experiments gained him a reputation as an innovator in the art of sensation. His marriage in 1763 to Renée Pélagie de Montreuil should have marked the beginning of a conventional aristocratic life. Renée Pélagie was the daughter of a respectable noble family, beautiful, intelligent, and genuinely devoted to her new husband. She had romantic notions about love and marriage that would have been touching if they weren't so tragically misplaced. What she didn't understand was that she had married a man incapable of genuine human connection, someone who viewed her not as a partner, but as the most convenient target for his developing appetites. Their wedding night was the first indication of what their marriage would become. Renée Pélagie emerged from the bridal chamber the next morning with bruises on her throat and wrists, moving with the careful gait of someone in significant pain. When questioned by her concerned ladies-in-waiting, she could only whisper that her husband had unconventional preferences and that she was learning to accommodate them. The physical evidence suggested something far more sinister than mere marital awkwardness. Over the following months, the servants at the Sade household began to notice disturbing patterns. Strange sounds echoed from the master's private chambers at all hours. Screaming that was quickly muffled, the sound of metal against flesh, sobbing that went on for hours. The Marquise began ordering unusual items from craftsmen in Paris, restraining devices disguised as furniture, implements that seemed designed more for torture than pleasure, and modifications to the basement rooms that required sworn secrecy from the workers. But it was the disappearances that truly revealed the extent of his activities. Serving girls would arrive at the estate and vanish within days, supposedly dismissed for unsatisfactory service. Local peasant families reported missing daughters who had gone to the great house seeking employment and were never seen again. The few survivors who escaped told stories that seemed too horrific to believe, tales of underground chambers, systematic torture, and a nobleman who treated human beings like laboratory animals in experiments designed to map the geography of suffering. Rose Keller's case in 1768 marked the first time the Marquise's activities came close to public exposure. Rose was a 36-year-old widow, desperate for work and struggling to feed her children, when a well-dressed gentleman approached her in Paris offering generous payment for domestic service at his country estate. She saw it as divine intervention. The gentleman was charming, well-spoken, and promised not just employment but advancement within his household. Rose had no way of knowing she was speaking to France's most dangerous predator. The carriage ride to the estate should have been her first warning. The Marquis's behavior grew increasingly erratic as they traveled further from Paris, his polite conversation giving way to strange questions about her pain tolerance and whether she had ever experienced true submission. When Rose tried to change the subject, he would laugh in ways that made her skin crawl, as if he knew secrets about her future that she couldn't imagine. Château de Lacoste rose from the Provençal landscape like something from a nightmare, its ancient stones seeming to absorb the sunlight rather than reflect it. The servants who greeted their arrival moved with the nervous efficiency of people who had learned to avoid their master's attention at all costs. Rose noticed that many of them bore small scars and moved with the careful posture of individuals who had experienced significant trauma. The Marquis showed Rose to what he called her quarters, though the room more closely resembled a prison cell than servant accommodation. The walls were stone, the single window barred, and the door equipped with locks that could only be operated from the outside. When Rose questioned these arrangements, the Marquise explained that they were necessary security measures for protecting valuable servants from potential kidnapping by rival noble families. That first night, Rose discovered the true nature of her employment. The Marquis arrived at her room after midnight, accompanied by two large men who served as his assistants in what he termed philosophical investigations. Rose was drugged with wine laced with opium, rendering her conscious, but unable to resist as she was transported to the basement chambers that would become her world for the next 6 weeks. What happened in those underground rooms defies civilized description. The Marquis had spent years developing techniques for prolonging suffering while keeping his subjects alive and conscious. He had studied anatomy to understand which injuries would cause maximum pain without causing death, and he had perfected psychological torture methods that could break a person's spirit while leaving them physically capable of enduring more abuse. Rose later testified that the Marquise treated her suffering like a scientific experiment, taking detailed notes about her reactions to different types of pain, measuring her responses to various forms of humiliation, and documenting the psychological changes he observed as her resistance gradually crumbled. He would spend hours explaining his theories about the nature of pleasure and pain, treating her broken body as a canvas for his twisted philosophy. But Rose Keller possessed something that many of the Marquise's previous victims had lacked: an iron will forged by years of hardship and maternal desperation. Despite the drugs, despite the torture, despite the systematic attempt to destroy her sanity, some core part of her remained unbroken. She began planning her escape from the moment she regained consciousness in that first basement chamber. The opportunity came during the 6th week of her captivity when one of the Marquis's assistants grew careless while transporting her between rooms. Rose had been feigning unconsciousness, waiting for exactly this moment. She struck her captor with a heavy iron candlestick, grabbed his keys, and fled the chateau in nothing but the tattered remains of her dress. Her escape caused a sensation that reverberated through French society. For the first time, one of the Marquis's victims had survived to tell her story, and Rose Keller was determined that the world would know the truth about the nobleman who had tortured her for sport. She went directly to the authorities in Paris, providing detailed testimony about her ordeal and demanding justice for the crimes committed against her. The Marquis's response revealed both his arrogance and his understanding of how French society actually worked. Rather than deny the charges, he claimed that Rose Keller had been a willing participant in consensual activities that she later regretted. He produced forged documents suggesting she was a prostitute seeking to extort money from a respectable nobleman, and he used his family's political connections to ensure that the investigation would be conducted by officials who owed their positions to side influence. But Rose's testimony was too detailed and too horrific to be completely suppressed. Word spread through Paris about the nobleman who kept torture chambers beneath his chateau, and even the notoriously tolerant French aristocracy began to view the Marquis with suspicion. Some members of high society were genuinely horrified by the revelations, while others were intrigued by the possibilities they suggested. The legal proceedings that followed revealed the true extent of corruption in the French justice system. Despite overwhelming evidence of the Marquis's crimes, including physical evidence from Rose's body and testimony from several other survivors who came forward after her example, the courts treated the case as a minor nobleman's prank that had gotten slightly out of hand. The Marquise was sentenced to a brief period of imprisonment in a comfortable chateau, followed by exile from Paris for 6 months. This slap on the wrist sent a clear message throughout French society. Aristocrats could commit any crime against commoners without fear of meaningful punishment. For the Marquis, it was confirmation that he was indeed above the law, free to pursue his appetites without restraint. The Rose Keller affair didn't end his career of systematic cruelty. It marked the beginning of his most prolific period of predation. The Marquis returned to his estate with renewed enthusiasm for his experiments, but now he was more careful about selecting victims who were less likely to escape or be believed if they survived to tell their stories. He began targeting orphans from church institutions, foreign servants with no local connections, and young women from families so desperate that they would accept any explanation for their daughters' disappearances rather than lose the money the Marquis paid for their silence. His techniques became more sophisticated as well. The basement chambers at Chateau de Lacoste were expanded and modified based on lessons learned from the Rose Keller incident. New restraining systems were installed that made escape virtually impossible, and the Marquis began keeping detailed medical supplies to ensure that his subjects could survive longer periods of torture. Perhaps most disturbing was the systematic way he began documenting his activities. The Marquis commissioned artists to create detailed drawings of his torture sessions, and he kept meticulous written records of his subjects' reactions to different forms of abuse. These documents, discovered centuries later in sealed chambers of the chateau, provide a horrifying window into the mind of history's most methodical sadist. The records reveal that the Marquis viewed his victims not as human beings, but as research subjects in a grand experiment designed to map the limits of human endurance. He was particularly interested in the psychological aspects of suffering, documenting how hope could be systematically destroyed and how the human spirit could be broken through careful application of trauma. One surviving document describes his educational methodology for breaking new subjects. The process began with several days of relative comfort, allowing victims to believe they might be treated well if they cooperated. Then came gradual escalation, minor discomforts that grew steadily worse, small violations of dignity that prepared subjects for greater humiliations, brief moments of kindness that made subsequent cruelty more psychologically devastating. The Marquis was particularly proud of what he called his architectural approach to torture. Different chambers in his basement served different psychological functions, rooms designed to create claustrophobic panic, spaces that used mirrors and lighting to disorient subjects, chambers equipped with devices that could inflict precise amounts of pain without causing death. He had created what amounted to a university of human suffering, with himself as both professor and sole student. But even the Marquis's carefully controlled environment couldn't prevent all escapes. Over the years, several more victims managed to flee Chateau de Lacoste, though most were too traumatized to provide coherent testimony about their experiences. The few who did speak out found themselves facing the same institutional indifference that had protected the Marquis after the Rose Keller affair. French society in the 1770s was experiencing the intellectual ferment that would eventually lead to revolution. But this philosophical awakening coexisted comfortably with systematic cruelty toward those without power or protection. The same salons that debated human rights and natural law saw nothing contradictory about a nobleman's right to torture peasants for entertainment. The Marquis himself became a curious celebrity in certain Parisian circles, hosting dinner parties where he would regale guests with carefully edited stories of his experiments. These gatherings attracted some of the period's most prominent intellectuals, artists, and political figures, many of whom found his theories about pain and pleasure philosophically intriguing, even if they claimed to disapprove of his methods. It was during this period that the Marquis began writing the works that would make him infamous. His novels and philosophical treatises were initially circulated privately among the same aristocratic circles that had protected him from legal consequences. These writings provided detailed descriptions of torture techniques, psychological manipulation methods, and philosophical justifications for treating other human beings as objects for gratification. But the Marquis's written works were tame compared to his continued real-world activities. The basement chambers at Chateau de Lacoste saw a steady stream of victims throughout the 1770s, young people who arrived seeking employment or assistance and disappeared into a nightmare that few would survive to describe. The patterns established during this period would define the rest of the Marquis's career. Careful selection of vulnerable victims, systematic torture designed to maximize suffering while preserving life, detailed documentation of techniques and results, and use of wealth and social position to avoid consequences for his crimes. As the 1780s approached and revolutionary fervor began building throughout France, the Marquis found himself in an increasingly precarious position. The social changes sweeping the country threatened the aristocratic immunity that had protected him for decades, but they also created new opportunities for predation as traditional authority structures collapsed and displaced people became easier targets. The French Revolution that began in 1789 should have meant the end of the Marquis's reign of terror, as the new republic proclaimed the equality of all citizens and the end of aristocratic privilege. Instead, it marked the beginning of his most prolific period of criminal activity, as the chaos of revolutionary France provided perfect cover for a predator who had spent decades perfecting his techniques. The Marquis reinvented himself as a champion of Republican values, writing pamphlets denouncing the aristocracy he had been born into, and positioning himself as a defender of common people's rights. This political transformation was purely opportunistic, a calculated move to protect himself from revolutionary justice while gaining access to new categories of potential victims. The revolutionary government, desperate for educated allies who could help establish their new society, embraced the reformed noblemen who seemed to embody their ideals of personal transformation and political redemption. The Marquis was appointed to various official positions that gave him authority over prisons, orphanages, and other institutions housing vulnerable populations. These appointments provided him with unprecedented access to potential victims while offering official protection for his activities. As a revolutionary administrator, the Marquis could transfer prisoners between facilities, authorize the release of certain individuals into his personal custody, and conduct inspections of institutions that housed young people with no families to protect them. The prison records from this period, recently discovered in French National Archives, reveal the systematic way the Marquis used his official positions to select and acquire victims. Young prisoners convicted of minor offenses would be transferred to remote facilities where they disappeared from all records. Orphans would be removed from institutions for revolutionary education and never seen again. Foreign refugees seeking citizenship would be placed under the Marquis's supervision and vanish into his private network of safe houses and hidden chambers. During the Reign of Terror, when thousands were executed for political crimes, a few more missing persons attracted no official attention. The revolutionary government was too busy consolidating power and eliminating enemies to investigate the disappearance of people who had no political importance or family connections. The Marquis established a network of properties throughout France where he could conduct his activities away from public scrutiny. These locations were presented as revolutionary education centers or rehabilitation facilities for former aristocrats seeking to prove their loyalty to the new regime. In reality, they were carefully designed prisons where the Marquis could pursue his experiments without interruption. The techniques he had perfected at Château de Lacoste were refined and systematized during this period. The Marquis developed standardized procedures for breaking subjects psychologically, documented methods for maximizing physical suffering while preserving life, and created training materials that could be used to teach his techniques to carefully selected assistants. These assistants, recruited from the ranks of revolutionary zealots and common criminals, provided the Marquis with an expanding network of collaborators who could help identify potential victims and dispose of evidence when subjects finally died from their treatment. The revolutionary rhetoric of the period, with its emphasis on destroying old forms of consciousness and creating new types of human beings, provided perfect ideological cover for activities that were actually designed to destroy human beings completely. The Marquis's written works from this period reflect his growing confidence in his methods and his belief that he had discovered fundamental truths about human nature through his systematic torture of hundreds of victims. His philosophical treatises argue that conventional morality is an artificial construct designed to suppress natural human instincts, and that true enlightenment comes through the complete abandonment of compassion and empathy. But underneath the grandiose philosophical language, these writings are essentially instruction manuals for psychological and physical torture. They provide detailed descriptions of techniques for breaking human spirits, methods for maximizing suffering, and strategies for avoiding detection by authorities. The Marquis had created what amounted to a comprehensive guide to systematic cruelty, dressed up in the intellectual fashions of his era. The end of the Reign of Terror in 1794 brought new dangers for the Marquis, as the revolutionary government began investigating the activities of officials who had used their positions for personal gain. Several of his former colleagues were executed for corruption and abuse of authority, and investigators began examining the network of facilities the Marquis had established supposedly for revolutionary purposes. The discovery of the true nature of these institutions created a scandal that threatened to expose the full extent of the Marquis's crimes. Investigators found chambers equipped with restraining devices, collections of implements designed for torture, and detailed records documenting years of systematic abuse. Most damning were the testimonies of survivors who had escaped from the Marquis's facilities and the physical evidence of crimes that could not be explained away as revolutionary justice. But once again, the Marquis's wealth and connections protected him from the full consequences of his actions. Key evidence mysteriously disappeared from official files. Potential witnesses were intimidated into silence or found dead under suspicious circumstances. And the investigation was quietly transferred to officials who had been compromised by bribes or threats. The Marquis was briefly imprisoned, but his confinement was more comfortable than the accommodations provided to most citizens, and he continued writing and planning new projects throughout his incarceration. Prison records show that he received regular visitors, maintained extensive correspondence with supporters outside, and even had access to young prisoners who were placed in his care for educational purposes. When he was finally released in 1799, the Marquis emerged to find a France that was rapidly abandoning revolutionary ideals in favor of stability and order under Napoleon Bonaparte. The new regime was less interested in ideological purity than in practical governance, creating opportunities for anyone with useful skills or knowledge to find a place in the expanding imperial bureaucracy. But what happened during those final 15 years of his life was perhaps the most horrifying chapter of all. Because by then, the Marquis had perfected something that went beyond individual cruelty. He had created a system that could operate without his direct involvement, a network of trained disciples who could continue his work even after his death. The truth about this network wouldn't emerge until the 1950s, when construction workers renovating old buildings across France began discovering sealed chambers, hidden tunnels, and underground facilities that all showed signs of systematic modification for purposes that defied innocent explanation. The Marquis offered his services to Napoleon's government as an expert in psychological warfare and prisoner interrogation, positions that would have given him official authority to torture enemies of the state. Fortunately for potential victims, Napoleon's advisors recognized the dangers of employing such an obviously unstable individual and declined his offers of assistance. Rejected by the imperial government and increasingly isolated from respectable society, the Marquis spent his final years operating an underground network of private facilities where wealthy clients could indulge in activities that were too extreme even for Napoleon's relatively tolerant regime. These establishments, disguised as exclusive social clubs or private medical facilities, catered to aristocrats and wealthy merchants who had developed appetites for systematic cruelty during the social upheavals of the previous decades. The Marquis's final victims came primarily from this commercial operation, which provided him with both financial support and access to carefully selected subjects who could be tortured without attracting official attention. The clients who paid for these services were required to maintain absolute secrecy about the nature of the activities, creating a conspiracy of silence that protected both the Marquis and his customers from exposure. When the Marquis finally died in 1814 at the Charenton Asylum, he left behind a legacy of human destruction that stretched across 5 decades and hundreds of victims. His death was officially attributed to natural causes, but asylum records suggest he may have been poisoned by authorities who feared that his continued existence posed a threat to social stability. The immediate aftermath of his death saw a systematic effort to suppress evidence of his crimes and sanitize his reputation for posterity. Family members destroyed personal papers, government officials sealed investigation files, and former associates worked to ensure that surviving witnesses would never speak publicly about their experiences. But the Marquis had been too prolific and too careless to completely hide his activities. Physical evidence remained in the form of modified buildings, hidden chambers, and collections of implements that could serve no innocent purpose. More importantly, some of his victims had survived to bear witness, and their testimonies preserved the truth about his crimes, even when official records were destroyed or suppressed. The word sadism entered common usage as a direct result of the Marquise's reputation, but this linguistic legacy sanitized his actual crimes by reducing them to an abstract concept rather than acknowledging the specific human suffering he caused. Academic discussions of his philosophical writings further obscured the reality of his victims' experiences by treating his torture methods as theoretical propositions rather than documented practices. Modern scholars who have examined the surviving evidence estimate that the Marquise may have been responsible for the torture and murder of over 200 people during his lifetime, making him one of history's most prolific serial killers. Yet he is remembered primarily as a writer and philosopher rather than as the predator he actually was. This historical amnesia reflects society's ongoing reluctance to confront the reality of systematic cruelty, especially when it involves individuals whose social status or intellectual achievements provide cover for their crimes. The Marquise's story demonstrates how wealth, political connections, and cultural sophistication can protect predators from consequences while their victims are forgotten and silenced. The techniques the Marquise developed for psychological torture and systematic dehumanization were refined and employed by totalitarian regimes throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. His methods for breaking human spirits influenced military interrogation techniques, prison systems, and even psychiatric treatment programs that prioritize control over healing. Perhaps most disturbing, his philosophical justifications for treating other human beings as objects for gratification continue to influence contemporary culture in ways that are rarely acknowledged. The casual acceptance of others' suffering, the reduction of human beings to sources of entertainment, and the belief that power grants the right to inflict pain all echo the Marquise's core beliefs about the nature of human relationships. The servant girl who opened this story, lying terrified in that underground chamber, represents all the nameless victims whose suffering built the Marquise's reputation and whose voices have been silenced by history's preference for comfortable myths over disturbing truths. Her pain was real, her fear was justified, and her story deserves to be remembered not as philosophical abstraction, but as human tragedy. The Marquis de Sade gave his name to sadism, but he gave much more than that to history. He demonstrated how evil can disguise itself as sophistication, how cruelty can masquerade as philosophy, and how society will protect predators when acknowledging their crimes would threaten comfortable illusions about human nature and social progress. His victims' voices cry out across the centuries, demanding recognition, justice, and remembrance. They remind us that behind every system of oppression are individual human beings whose suffering matters more than the theories used to justify their pain. The Marquise's legacy is not his writings or his philosophical contributions. It is the hundreds of lives he destroyed and the countless others who have suffered similar fates because societies prefer not to see the monsters walking among them.